Look at this winged woman ascending through luminous clouds. Her posture sits between repentance and transfiguration. Notice the mechanics of her climb. Her ascent is strictly derivative. As John 15 states, "Apart from me, you can do nothing." This specific visual dynamic maps directly onto the deepest structural level of the Bible. The text operates as a vertical grammar narrative. It uses spatial relationships to communicate spiritual realities. The rules of this framework are strict. God is positioned absolutely above. Revelation and creation descend from that height, and the creatures below are then either lifted up, cast down, or raised. Mapping these spatial rules allows us to see how ancient revelatory texts were designed to function. More importantly, it reveals why specific moments of communication in the text eventually break down. Consider the encounter in the Gospel of John, chapter 3, between Jesus and the religious scholar Nicodemus. Jesus describes salvation and authority using highly specific spatial vocabulary. We can map this on a simple vertical axis. He speaks of being born from above, anothen. He talks about the one who has ascended, anabino, and the one who has descended, katabino. Nicodemus is famously confused by this. Modern devotional commentaries often treat his confusion as a personal failure, assuming a learned teacher should have easily grasped these concepts. But that reading ignores the mechanics of the text. Nicodemus is a highly educated receiver attempting to navigate a communication system with inherent flaws. He is relying on a low-precision revelatory channel. The older texts he studied had severe historical delays, heavy symbolic compression, and ambiguous terminology. The signal was buried in static. His inability to understand Jesus is diagnostic. It suggests the older methods of Old Testament mediation were underperforming, leaving even a good-willed expert entirely in the dark. To see how this system actually works, we have to plot the full vertical boundaries of biblical reality. This diagram shows the master axis, God occupying the absolute top, and lower earth anchoring the bottom. Jesus appeals to the Old Testament story of Moses lifting the bronze serpent in the wilderness, placing that event squarely on our upward vector. Elsewhere, Jesus appeals to the story of the prophet Jonah being swallowed by the great fish. Within the Johannine text, these references function as canonical patterns of elevation and burial, operating outside the requirements of modern historiography. Look at Jonah's trajectory. He goes down into the sea, down into the belly of the fish, before being brought back up. This pattern establishes that a true ascent requires an initial, compliant descent. Scholars use the Greek term katabasis to describe this downward motion. Broadly defined, it is a journey into supersensory realms or the underworld. Ancient katabasis narratives frequently blur the boundaries between physical death, a descent into deep psychological terrain, and a final reintegration on a higher level. This pattern establishes a requirement of the grammar. Legitimate biblical ascent follows an authorized downward passage. We can test this rule by looking at the exact opposite vertical motion, best illustrated by the classical Greek myth of Daedalus and his son Icarus. Icarus represents the ultimate archetype of autonomous, self-authorized elevation. He does not wait to be summoned, and he does not begin by descending in obedience. He flies upward, relying strictly on technical ingenuity. And that upward climb directly triggers his catastrophe, because human cleverness consistently mismeasures the vast scale of reality above it. This specific Icarian pattern maps perfectly onto the cryptic biblical traditions regarding the fall of Satan. An aggressive upward motion toward the highest heaven is met by a total collapse, sending the subject plummeting straight past the earthline and into the abyss. Contrast those fallen figures with the archangel Michael. He holds a stable, lawful position within heaven, fighting securely from an upper rank without falling. The structural reason for his stability is embedded in his name. The Hebrew Mikael translates to the question, "Who is like God?" It is a literal anti-hubristic formula. It implies that no one is like God. Structural stability in the upper realms is only achieved through the absolute negation of the desire to rise autonomously. We do not have to rely exclusively on ancient myth or theology to observe this vertical law in action. It governs concrete, modern terrestrial history as well. Take the elite Polish high-altitude climbers, Wanda Rutkiewicz and Jerzy Kukuczka. Rutkiewicz and Kukuczka were elite, historically real masters of the physical vertical axis, providing a concrete weight to these otherwise mythic archetypes. Yet they operated strictly under the rules of descent. Kukuczka once observed that the moment he reached a summit, the achievement stopped mattering. Upward success immediately transformed into an urgent downward necessity. Both climbers ultimately disappeared or died during high-altitude ascents. If we plot their trajectories onto our framework, the line climbs to the absolute limit of earthly elevation, but it abruptly terminates before it can return to the baseline. Modern artistic tributes, like Witold Piotr Nowak's musical track Ascend, attempt to poetically transfigure these tragedies, imagining the fallen climbers continuing their upward journey among choirs of angels. Their stories highlight the structural reality of the axis. A climb that ends at the peak is an incomplete motion. Within this grammar, human ascent is only validated by a successful return to the baseline. Up to this point, we have only looked at this grammar strictly from the side. But if we tilt our perspective and look down from above, that towering vertical height flattens into a series of horizontal concentric circles. Upward elevation translates perfectly into horizontal inwardness. This is exactly how the architecture of the Second Jerusalem Temple functioned. It was a physical, spatial map of both status and access. This diagram illustrates the temple's specific graded zones. It begins on the outside with the court of women, then moves sequentially inward through the court of the Israelites, the court of the priests, the sanctuary, and finally reaches the dead center, the Holy of Holies. The layout enforced a strict rule. Closer proximity to the center demanded a higher degree of holiness, and it carried a drastically increased mortal danger. Centuries later, this architectural logic morphed into a sprawling ecclesiological structure. We see the exact same geometry in the framework defined at Vatican II. Instead of physical courtyards, Vatican II outlined circles of belonging. The framework places fully incorporated Catholics at the tight inner ring and expands outward through varying degrees of relation, eventually encompassing all people of goodwill at the periphery. The orientation shifts, but the underlying grammar is identical. Whether a person is moving upward into the clouds or inward toward an altar, extreme nearness always intensifies responsibility. If we pull back, we can merge these datasets: the paths of Moses and Jonah, the falls of Icarus, the rings of the Temple and Vatican II, into one map. This allows us to locate Nicodemus within the massive structure. Looking at his coordinates, we can see exactly why he failed to grasp the mechanics of salvation. He was standing at the absolute bottom of a system, attempting to parse data that was heavily distributed and tightly compressed into obscure symbols. Jesus uses this discourse to expose the underperformance of a slow, symbolically compressed communication channel. The dialogue performs a dual action. Jesus reveals the precise mechanics of the heavenly domain, while simultaneously indicting the sheer underperformance of every text and prophet that came before him. The vertical grammar narrative is universal. It structures ancient scriptural texts, shapes classical Greek myth, dictates physical temple architecture, and governs modern terrestrial history. Across all of these various domains, we consistently observe two distinct types of motion playing out on the vertical axis. The first is self-authored autonomous ambition. It attempts to seize the height by force, and it inevitably collapses under the immense scale of reality. The second is a participatory, obedient motion. It acknowledges the required downward passage, waiting for a higher authority to initiate the return. Because ultimately, what rises by vanity falls by heat, and what rises by grace endures the light.